About Hampton Court Palace. Hampton Court Palace is a British royal palace located in the London Borough of Richmond upon Thames, Greater London, and in the historic county of Middlesex. It is situated 11.7 miles (18.8 kilometres) south of Charing Cross and was first occupied by the British royal family in the 18th century. Hampton Court was originally built for Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, a favourite of King Henry VIII, around 1514. In 1529, after Wolsey retired, the palace was taken over by the king, and enlarged. The following century, William III undertook a major renovation and expansion project of the palace intended to rival the Palace of Versailles in Paris. However, the project was halted in 1694, leaving the palace in two distinct architectural styles, Tudor and Baroque. Today, the palace is open to the public, and is one of London's top tourist attractions. The palace is managed and maintained by an independent charity called Historic Royal Palaces, which receives no funding from the government or the Crown. The palace exhibits many works of art from the royal collection. Apart from the palace itself and its gardens, other attractions for visitors include the famous maze, the historic royal tennis courts and the Great Grapevine, which was the world's largest grapevine in 2005. The palace's gardens are the location of the annual Hampton Court Palace Festival and Hampton Court Gardens Festival. History of Hampton Court Palace. Hampton Court Palace originally belonged to the Order of St. John of Jerusalem. The palace was leased first to John Watt in the mid-15th century, and then to statesman Sir Giles Daubeny in 1494. Daubeny expanded the earlier structure, and built the Great Kitchen which still stands today though much altered. After Daubeny's death in 1508, his 14-year-old heir, Henry Daubeny, had to wait until 1514 to inherit his father's estate. A month later, he relinquished his lease, and the Order of St. John of Jerusalem relet Hampton Court to Thomas Wolsey. In Tudor times, Thomas Wolsey, Archbishop of York, Henry VIII's chief minister and favourite, took over the site of Hampton Court Palace in 1514. Over the following 7 years, Wolsey spent lavishly £200,000 crowns to build the finest palace in England at Hampton Court. Today, little of Wolsey's building work remains unchanged. The first courtyard, the base court, beyond plan, was his creation, as was the second, inner gatehouse C which leads to the clock court D. Wolsey's seal remains visible over the entrance arch of the clock tower which contained his private rooms O on plan. The base court contained 44 lodgings reserved for guests, while the second court today, Clock Court, contained the very best rooms, the state apartments, reserved for the king and his family. Henry VIII stayed in the state apartments as Wolsey's guest immediately after their completion in 1525. In building his palace, Wolsey was attempting to create a Renaissance cardinal's palace of a rectilinear symmetrical plan with grand apartments on a raised piano noble, all rendered with classical detailing. The historian Jonathan Foyle has suggested that it is likely that Wolsey had been inspired by Paolo Cortese's De Cardinalitu, a manual for cardinals that included advice on palatial architecture, published in 1510. The architectural historian Sir John Summerson asserts that the palace shows the essence of Wolsey, the plain English churchman who nevertheless made his sovereign the arbiter of Europe and who built and furnished Hampton Court to show foreign embassies that Henry VIII's chief minister knew how to live as graciously as any cardinal in Rome. Whatever the concepts were, the architecture is an excellent and rare example of a 30-year era when English architecture was in a harmonious transition from domestic Tudor, strongly influenced by Perpendicular Gothic, to the Italian Renaissance classical style. Perpendicular Gothic owed nothing historically to the Renaissance style, yet harmonized well with it. This blending of styles was realized by a small group of Italian craftsmen working at the English court in the 2nd and 3rd decades of the 16th century. They specialized in the adding of Renaissance ornament to otherwise straightforward Tudor buildings. It was one of these, Giovanni da Maiano, who was responsible for the set of 8 relief busts of Roman emperors which were set in the Tudor brickwork. Wolsey was only to enjoy his palace for a few years. In 1529, knowing that his enemies and the king were engineering his downfall, he passed the palace to the king as a gift. Wolsey died in 1530. Within 6 months of coming into ownership, the king began his own rebuilding and expansion. Henry VIII's court consisted of over 1,000 people, while the king owned over 60 houses and palaces. Few of these were large enough to hold the assembled court, and thus one of the first of the king's building works in order to transform Hampton Court to a principal residence was to build the vast kitchens. These were quadrupled in size in 1529, enabling the king to provide bouche of court free food and drink for his entire court. The architecture of King Henry's new palace followed the design precedent set by Wolsey, perpendicular Gothic-inspired Tudor with restrained Renaissance ornament. This hybrid architecture was to remain almost unchanged for nearly a century, until Inigo Jones introduced strong classical influences from Italy to the London palaces of the first Stuart kings. Between 1532 and 1535 Henry added the Great Hall, the last medieval Great Hall built for the English monarchy, and the Royal Tennis Court. The Great Hall has a carved hammer beam roof. During Tudor times, this was the most important room of the palace. Here, the king would dine in state seated at a table upon a raised dais. The hall took 5 years to complete, so impatient was the king for completion that the masons were compelled to work throughout the night by candlelight. The gatehouse to the second, inner court was adorned in 1540 with the Hampton Court astronomical clock, an early example of a pre-Copernican astronomical clock. Still functioning, the clock shows the time of day, the phases of the moon, the month, the quarter of the year, the date, the sun and star sign, and high water at London Bridge. This last item was of great importance to those visiting this Thames-side palace from London, as the preferred method of transport at the time was by barge, and at low water London Bridge created dangerous rapids. This gatehouse is also known today as Anne Boleyn's Gate, after Henry's second wife. Work was still underway on Anne Boleyn's apartments above the gate when Boleyn was beheaded. During the Tudor period, the palace was the scene of many historic events. In 1537, the king's much-desired male heir, the future Edward VI, was born at the palace, and the child's mother, Jane Seymour, died there 2 weeks later. 4 years afterwards, whilst attending Mass in the palace's chapel, the king was informed of the adultery of his fifth wife, Catherine Howard. She was then confined to her room for a few days before being sent to Sion House and then on to the Tower of London. Legend claims she briefly escaped her guards and ran through the haunted gallery to beg Henry for her life, but she was recaptured. King Henry died in January 1547 and was succeeded by his son Edward VI, and then by both his daughters in turn. It was to Hampton Court that Queen Mary I, Henry's elder daughter, retreated with King Philip to spend her honeymoon, after their wedding at Winchester. Mary chose Hampton Court as the place for the birth of her first child, which turned out to be the first of 2 phantom pregnancies. Mary had initially wanted to give birth at Windsor Castle as it was a more secure location, and she was still fearful of rebellion. But Hampton Court was considerably larger and could accommodate the entire court and more besides. Mary stayed at the palace awaiting the birth of the child for over 5 months, and only left because of the uninhabitable state of the palace due to the court being kept in the one location for so long. Her court departed for the much smaller Oatlands Palace. Mary was succeeded by her half-sister, Elizabeth I, and it was Elizabeth who had the Eastern Privy Kitchen built, today. This is the palace's public tea room. Stuarts and early Hanoverians. On the death of Elizabeth I in 1603, the Tudor period came to an end. The Queen was succeeded by her first cousin twice removed, James I of the House of Stuart. Two entertainments for the Stuart court were staged in the Great Hall in January 1604, the Masque of Indian and China Knights and the Vision of the 12 Goddesses. On January 6, Scottish courtiers performed a sword dance for Anne of Denmark. Their dance was compared to a Spanish motochin. Later in 1604, the palace was the site of King James' meeting with representatives of the English Puritans, known as the Hampton Court Conference. While an agreement with the Puritans was not reached, the meeting led to James's commissioning of the King James Version of the Bible. King James was succeeded in 1625 by his son, the ill-fated Charles I. Hampton Court was to become both his palace and his prison. It was also the setting for his honeymoon with his 15-year-old bride, Henrietta Maria, in 1625. Following King Charles's execution in 1649, the palace became the property of the Commonwealth presided over by Oliver Cromwell. Unlike some other former royal properties, the palace escaped relatively unscathed. While the government auctioned much of the contents, the building was ignored. After the restoration, King Charles II and his successor James II visited Hampton Court but largely preferred to reside elsewhere. By current French court standards, Hampton Court now appeared old-fashioned. It was in 1689, shortly after Louis XIV's court had moved permanently to Versailles, that the palace's antiquated state was addressed. England had joint monarchs, William III and Mary II. Within months of their accession, they embarked on a massive rebuilding project at Hampton Court. The intention was to demolish the Tudor palace a section at a time while replacing it with a huge modern palace in the Baroque style retaining only Henry VIII's Great Hall. The country's most eminent architect, Sir Christopher Wren, was called upon to draw the plans, while the master of works was to be William Talman. The plan was for a vast palace constructed around two courtyards at right angles to each other. Wren's design for a domed palace bore resemblances to the work of Jules Hardouin Mansart and Louis Le Vau, both architects employed by Louis XIV at Versailles. It has been suggested, though, that the plans were abandoned because the resemblance to Versailles was too subtle and not strong enough. At this time, it was impossible for any sovereign to visualize a palace that did not emulate Versailles' repetitive Baroque form. However, the resemblances are there. While the facades are not so long as those of Versailles, they have similar, seemingly unstoppable repetitive rhythms beneath a long flat skyline. The monotony is even repeated as the facade turns the corner from the east to the south fronts. However, Hampton Court, unlike Versailles, is given an extra dimension by the contrast between the pink brick and the pale Portland stone coins, frames, and banding. Further diversion is added by the circular and decorated windows of the second-floor mezzanine. This theme is repeated in the inner fountain court, but the rhythm is faster and the windows, unpedimented on the outer facades, are given pointed pediments in the courtyard. This has led the courtyard to be described as startling, as of simultaneous exposure to a great many eyes with raised eyebrows. During this work, half the Tudor palace was replaced and Henry VIII's staterooms and private apartments were both lost. The new wings around the fountain court contained new state apartments and private rooms, one set for the king and one for the queen. Each suite of staterooms was accessed by a state staircase. The royal suites were of completely equal value in order to reflect William and Mary's unique status as joint sovereigns. The king's apartments face south over the Privy Garden, the queen's east over the Fountain Garden. The suites are linked by a gallery running the length of the east facade, another reference to Versailles, where the king and queen's apartments are linked by the Hall of Mirrors. However, At Hampton Court, the linking gallery is of more modest proportions and decoration. The King's Staircase was decorated with frescoes by Antonio Varillo and delicate ironwork by Jean Tigel. Other artists commissioned to decorate the rooms included Grinling Gibbons, Sir James Thornhill and Jacques Rousseau. Furnishings were designed by Daniel Marot. After the death of Queen Mary, King William lost interest in the renovations, and work ceased. However, it was in Hampton Court Park in 1702 that he fell from his horse, later dying from his injuries at Kensington Palace. He was succeeded by his sister-in-law Queen Anne, who continued the decoration and completion of the state apartments. On Queen Anne's death in 1714, the House of Stuart's rule came to an end. Queen Anne's successor was George I. He and his son George II were the last monarchs to reside at Hampton Court. 3 under George I's 6 rooms were completed in 1717 to the design of John Vanbrugh. Under George II and his wife, Caroline of Ansbach, further refurbishment took place, with the architect William Kent employed to design new furnishings and decor, including the Queen's Staircase, 1733, and the Cumberland Suite 1737 for the Duke of Cumberland. Today, the Queen's private apartments are open to the public. Further use of Hampton Court. Since the reign of King George II, no monarch has resided at Hampton Court. In fact, George III, from the moment of his accession, never set foot in the palace. He associated the state apartments with a humiliating scene when his grandfather had once struck him following an innocent remark. He did, however, have the grapevine planted here in 1763 and had the top 2 stories of the Great Gatehouse removed in 1773. From the 1760s, the palace was used to house grace and favor residents. Many of the palace rooms were adapted to be rent-free apartments, with vacant ones allocated by the Lord Chamberlain to applicants to reward past services rendered to the Crown. From 1862 to his death in 1867, the scientist and pioneer of electricity Michael Faraday lived here. From the 1960s, the number of new residents declined, with the last admitted in the 1980s. However, existing residents could continue to live there. In 2005, 3 remained, with none by 2017. In 1796, the Great Hall was restored, and in 1838, during the reign of Queen Victoria, the restoration was completed and the palace opened to the public. The heavy-handed restoration plan at this time reduced the Great Gatehouse, the palace's principal entrance, by 2 stories and removed the lead cupolas adorning its 4 towers. Once opened, the palace soon became a major tourist attraction, and, by 1881, over 10 million visits had been recorded. Visitors arrived both by boat from London and via Hampton Court Railway Station, opened in February 1849. On September 2, 1952, the palace was given statutory protection by being Grade I listed. Other buildings and structures within the grounds are separately Grade I listed, including the early 16th century Tilt Yard Tower, the only surviving example of the 5 original towers, Christopher Wren's Lion Gate built for Anne and George I, and the Tudor and 17th century perimeter walls. In 1986, the palace was damaged by a major fire, which spread to the King's apartments. The fire claimed the life of Lady Daphne Gale, widow of General Sir Richard Gale, who resided in a Grace and Favour apartment. She was in the habit of taking a lighted candle to her bedroom at night, which is thought to have started the fire. The Hampton Court fire led to a new program of restoration work which was completed in 1990. The Royal School of Needlework moved to premises within the palace from Prince's Gate in Kensington 1987, and the palace also houses the headquarters of Historic Royal Palaces, a charitable foundation. In the 21st century, The location was used for a performance of The Six Wives of Henry VIII by rock keyboardist Rick Wakeman in 2009. The Palace was the venue for the road cycling time trial of the 2012 Summer Olympics, and temporary structures for the event, including a set of thrones for time trialists in the medal positions, were installed in the grounds. In 2015, Hampton Court celebrated the 500th anniversary of the groundbreaking of construction of the palace. The celebrations included daily dramatist historical scenes. The palace's construction began on February 12, 1515. On February 9 the following year, Vincent Nichols, the Catholic Archbishop of Westminster, celebrated Vespers in the Chapel Royal. This was the first Catholic service held at the palace for 450 years, and the first since the Elizabethan religious settlement established Protestantism as the national denomination. Note: Hampton Court Palace is one of the most magnificent palaces in England, renowned for its beautiful gardens and intricate maze. It was originally built for Cardinal Thomas Wolsey in the early 16th century, before being given to King Henry VIII. With architecture that reflects power and opulence, Hampton Court is a must-see for those interested in British royal history. Inside the palace, visitors can see the magnificent Great Hall, the extensive royal kitchens, and the valuable art collection. The palace is also known for the legend of the ghost of Anne Boleyn, one of King Henry VIII's wives, who is said to haunt the halls of the palace wearing either a blue or black dress.